Before we start this episode, I'd just like to acknowledge the Yidinji people on whose land this podcast is recorded, as well as the other 70 traditional owner groups whose sea country makes up the Great Barrier Reef, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Good morning everyone and welcome to Wet on the Reef. I'm your host, diver and marine conservationist Tanya Murphy. Flying solo today as my trusty co-pilot and fellow fish whisperer Brett Goodburn is off on holiday. G'day to Brett if you're listening in out there. Now, before I introduce today's guest, here are a couple of major reef headlines from this week. Well, actually, first, I want to share that many people near Cairns and Port Douglas have been swimming with whales, minke whales, manta rays, dolphin sightings, and someone even told me they saw a dugong near Green Island. And that's all this week. So the reef is just going off this week. It's an amazing time of year, winter on the Great Barrier Reef. But there's been a couple of unhappy major reef headlines this week, which I have to share with you. So first, heartbreaking new research shows 92% of coral has died at Lizard Island after last year's bleaching event. It's one of the highest coral mortality rates ever recorded anywhere in the world. Scientists used drone images to compare the reef before and after the bleaching, and the transformation is quite devastating. You can see those images and a link to the study, which I've posted on the Word on the Reef Instagram stories. Now, this data that I'm mentioning is specific to Lizard Island. Reefs near Cairns and Port Douglas had much better coral survival rates, and the marine life here is going off at the moment, like I said. But these findings are still a stark warning about what's to come if we don't act fast on climate change, which is driving these mass bleaching events. In other news, at a meeting yesterday, UNESCO's World Heritage Committee has warned that Australia isn't doing enough to protect the Great Barrier Reef. The Government of Australia now has 6 months to strengthen reef policies, or the reef may be added to the World Heritage in Danger list. UNESCO highlighted issues like poor water quality, deforestation in reef catchments, and unsustainable fishing. But the biggest concern is climate change. Australia remains one of the highest polluters in the world per capita of carbon emissions and is still approving new coal and gas projects, including more than 20 planned coal expansions here in Queensland, right on the doorstep of our precious Great Barrier Reef. UNESCO says we need to do more towards our fair share in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, which means cutting our Australian emissions 90% by 2035 and stopping the approval of new fossil fuel projects. Time is critical right now because the Australian government is deciding its 2035 emissions reduction target right now and will announce it in September. So if you are passionate about protecting the reef, now is the time to join a climate action group and speak up. So I'll put some links in the show notes for any of those who are listening online. Now, if you're ready for something a bit more uplifting now, don't worry, because today's story is one of resilience, adventure, and survival against the odds. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be a castaway, stranded in the wilderness, relying on your wits, survival skills, and maybe some roasted stingray or kangaroo jerky to survive? Or maybe you're curious about how First Nations and Pacific Islander people once voyaged across oceans in dugout canoes long before GPS and freeze-dried meals were invented. Well, wonder no more, because today's guest has actually lived it. Mike Atkinson is a former military pilot turned solo adventurer, survival expert, and filmmaker. In 2021, he took on what might be one of the gutsiest challenges I've ever heard of. He built a 4-ton dugout canoe with his bare hands and probably a few power tools, then set sail 1,500 kilometres up the Great Barrier Reef from Townsville to the Torres Strait. No engine, no esky, no Uber Eats, just roasted stingrays, dried kangaroo, homemade fishing equipment, and a whole lot of determination. He captured every moment on camera, and now he's touring Australia with his documentary Modern Day Castaway, which is screening in Cairns next Thursday, the 17th of July. So I've seen the film previews online. It's a wild ride. So let's dive in. Mike, welcome to Wet on the Reef.
G'day, thanks for having me.
Great to have you on the show. So let's start at the beginning. Mike, you're a military pilot turned full-time adventure man. How did this life of survival adventures begin? Were you really good at Boy Scouts, or did this all start after watching one too many episodes of Bear Grylls?
No, it was definitely the Bush Tucker Man. Yeah, the Bush Tucker Man. I mean, I loved Malcolm Douglas as well, of course. So Russell Court, got to put in Russell Court as well. Yeah, so I saw that as a kid, and I thought two things. I saw Top Gun, and I wanted to do the Top Gun thing, and also the Bush Tucker Man, and I thought, oh yeah, I like to do both of those. I was lucky though as a kid. I got to go camping a fair bit. And I just thought that was the coolest kind of stuff, camping, fishing. I always, from the Bush Tucker Man and also some other experiences, I just thought Aboriginal culture was awesome in the way that they, knew how to survive with the bush. And so I nerded out on lots of Bush Tucker books as a kid and stuff. And yeah, but I just decided to pursue the piloting dream first. But I knew that in the military, both as an Air Force pilot and an Army helicopter pilot, it exposes you to a lot of survival training. And I ended up getting on, as a pilot, having a side gig as a survival instructor with a unit called North Force, which is a predominantly Aboriginal unit. So that's where I got to learn the real stuff from the real people.
Wow, so you're living every child's dream. I mean, any young boy that's seen Top Gun and, I don't know, Treasure Island or whatever, that not many people actually go forth and actually tick off those things off their bucket list. So well done. So let's talk about the journey. You paddled 1,500 kilometres along the Great Barrier Reef in a handmade dugout canoe. So just checking, at no point did you sneak into a McDonald's drive-thru or secretly check into a motel with aircon and Wi-Fi?
That's correct. And I should just step back a bit too. I'm in the process of trying to achieve my dreams, and I didn't fully tick the box of being a fighter pilot. So I do resilience talks to kids in schools and stuff, and I'm still trying to achieve my second dream after fully not completing the first one. So it's more about having your best crack at your dream, and along the way you get to experience most of it, even if you don't actually meet the objective. So I'm halfway through the second objective, which is to be like the Bush Tucker Man. But yes, I didn't receive any assistance as I went up. I felt that would have been cheating. So yeah, no Maccas, no Wi-Fi. Yeah.
That is a great message, because life is a journey of going towards those goals, and this canoe journey is sort of a bit of a metaphor for that, I suppose. So what inspired this adventure? Did someone dare you after a few beers, or was it inspired by someone throughout history?
Well, yeah, I mean, basically when I decided to start really pursuing that filmmaking career, I decided that it would make sense to put myself in historic survival situations to see if I could get my way out. So the first one I did was in the Kimberley, where I escaped the historic predicament of two downed German aviators, and I made a film out of that. Then in order to be able to fund the lack of funding that you get from trying to make a film independently, I moved the family to Saudi Arabia at the end of my flying career to save money and earn money tax exempt. And during that stage, I did another one in the Saudi desert, and it was hot and sandy, and I was dreaming up the Great Barrier Reef, the beautiful turquoise waters, and I thought, okay, the next one I'm going to do there, and I love dugout canoes, so let's look for a survival story where there's a legitimate excuse to build a dugout canoe. So I researched and fairly quickly came across a guy called James Morrill, who in 1846 wrecked on Minerva Shoal, which is 900 k's off the Great Barrier Reef, way outside the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah, it's actually part of New Caledonia. It's not even in Australian waters.
Yeah, 900 k's. And so they hit a reef. 21 of them managed to cut down rigging and stuff and make this makeshift raft. And they sailed for 42 days towards the Australian mainland. And they managed to get through the Great Barrier Reef. 14 of them died. Only 7 survived ashore to get ashore. And most of them died fairly quickly. But after a few years, there was only one guy left, and that was James Morrill. And he assimilated into Aboriginal society, Birragubba clan. And he learnt their language, experienced their full way of life, became part of their culture. And 17 years later, when the Frontier War swept through, he re-assimilated into European society and lived in Bowen. And he wrote a book, or most of a book. It's called a pamphlet. And that's how we know what his experiences were like. So I just thought, I'm obviously not going to recreate it and live in Bowen for 17 years. I just wanted to know, I knew that shipwreck survivors gravitated towards a certain rescue haven on Cape York. And so I did a research trip up the coast and found out where that was. It's on Booby Island, north of Cape York. And so I just wanted to see, part of the film is, did he want to escape? And I reckon he probably didn't want to. And I go into the reasons why in the film. I reckon there's a reasonable chance he had a family, an Aboriginal family, and maybe he only reassimilated to advocate for their rights in order to protect them. But I just wanted to see whether he could escape that with the tools he had. And the best way to do that is to build a dugout canoe and sail at 1,500 k's to this rescue haven that Governor Bligh set up on Booby Island.
It's wild to think that what you've done is an extreme survival feat, especially by modern standards, but it could have just been a normal activity to go and visit relatives for First Nations people, like Pacific Islanders and Aboriginal people who have been travelling on things like dugout canoes for thousands of years. Did you chat with any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander folks about your idea before heading off?
Yeah, for sure. And so Aboriginal people were making double outrigger dugout canoes for a long time. When Captain Cook first sailed up the coast, he found them on Lizard Island. I spoke to the traditional owners at Lockhart River. Their people would go as far out as Rain Island, which is a really long way out, further than I was going offshore. They would normally man them with 3 to 4 people, and they had very well-established roles within the canoe. They could switch between roles. One was the steerer, one was the hunter, the dugong. And it was a really well-defined craft. They would divvy up the dugong meat in accordance with your hierarchical position in the tribe, in who got the canoe and all this kind of stuff. And so there was a lot of this was recorded by a guy called Donald Thompson in the early 1900s, and he drew pictures of the canoes that they made. So I didn't want to copy that canoe because this shipwreck survivor was actually the carpenter's mate, and I wanted to basically build whatever I thought would be the best to survive such a long trip up the reef. And I've also had a fair bit of experience in northern waters, and I know how choppy it can get. So mine was a mix of Aboriginal techniques and also Western techniques from the 18th and 1900s.
Absolutely fascinating. And before we continue on with the Great Barrier Reef trip, just an aside, my partner and I binge watched Alone Australia, which you were a star in, and you survived in Tasmania for, 2 months or something?
64 days, yeah.
That's streaming for free on SBS, I believe, for if anyone else wants to see Mike's other survival challenge in Tasmania. And you actually built a canoe on that show as well. So you've got a bit of experience with building canoes, haven't you?
Well, yeah, in fact, this Barrier Reef trip was before Alone Australia. So, on that show I built one out of a tarpaulin, and it was like a little bit like what the Eskimos used to do with sealskin, but I just built a frame out of wood but covered it in a tarpaulin.
Yeah, you're a very handy guy. It was very good to watch, hard to live through, I can only imagine. And so now I'd like to know about this beast of a canoe, 4 tons of handcrafted awesomeness. What was it made of? How did you build it? And how many splinters did you get?
Sure. Well, I wanted to ideally build it out of the same kind of woods that Aboriginal people were using. From what I understand, they were using breadfruit, jackfruit, white beech hibiscus, bombax, another one. But I wasn't able to get one. And also, these are big, beautiful trees, and even if you can find one outside a national park, I didn't really want to destroy one anyway. So I was trying to find one that had been removed by an arborist. The only thing I could find was a Norfolk pine right down where I live in New South Wales. And so I managed to rescue it before it was chopped up in a mill by a farmer. And I got it put on a truck, put in my backyard. And I just started cracking away at it with the same tools that James Morrill would likely have had. He definitely had an axe because he said it in his book, but he also would have had an adze and those kinds of things. So I would do each first step with the traditional tools, but because I didn't have, a whole clan of people that traditionally would build a dugout canoe, I would use power tools to do repeat steps, which just shortened the process, which I had hoped would only take 4 months, but it ended up taking 14 months. And part of that reason was because I'm experienced with the waters up there, and I've been in a Category 2 cyclone in a 4-metre boat, and I remember thinking to myself, I never want to be in this position again, and here I am. So I had these PTSD moments recalling these horrible seas, curling over my boat, and that kept me up at night, and I just kept on improving the capability of the canoe. I raised the bow and the stern, and just thinking through all of the different things that could happen. So, it ended up taking 14 months to build.
Wow, I can't believe that you actually did a lot of it with the old-fashioned hand tools. That is an incredible accomplishment. And so as you mentioned, you live in New South Wales, and the canoe weighed 4 tons, I understand. So how on earth did you get this canoe to Townsville? Did you paddle it there as well, or was there a very confused truck driver involved?
Yeah, so the log was 4 tons, and after I'd hollowed it out and put the outriggers on and everything, it was about 750 kilos, which is small enough to stick on a boat trailer. And I was constantly plagued by COVID, like Queensland border closed and then reopened and then it was about to close. So I rushed across the border and dragged it up to Townsville. But I first of all did a test sail in New South Wales. The weather was not suitable and ended up having to get towed in by the New South Wales police, which is not a good look when you're doing
not a good start.
A remote journey. And that is why I felt that I had to improve safety somehow. So I did take a small electric engine like fishermen use just to help me get out of a tight spot, but it wasn't enough that I could motor along. I only had an hour of battery life and it was just to help me in a tight spot. But yeah, so I got up to Townsville and almost got closed down again by that 3-day shutdown in Townsville. It happened just as I got there, but I was eventually released and I actually took off from AIMS, Australian Institute of Marine Science. That is the place where James Morrill came ashore, and there's a granite boulder there, sort of a cave, an overhang really. And so I basically started from that position. I was very grateful that AIMS allowed me to be on site. And I had traditional owners that were going to see me off with a smoking ceremony, preferably from that cave. But COVID, just after I finalised all that stuff, COVID knocked it on the head. But I did manage to depart by myself.
So you've launched your canoe. What was it like being out there? Just you, the canoe, the ocean, and occasional curious crocodiles?
Well, it was actually quite stressful. The weather was perfect to begin with, which is great. I really needed that. But it was stressful because I knew that until I really experienced 25 knots and 2.5 metre seas, I was untested. And I just had these mild conditions really for the first few weeks. So it was good, but also it was tense because I'm like, there was still lots of things happening. Like even in reasonably mild seas, my rudder pinion snapped. I fixed that. Then the rudder snapped in half. I was stuck on a national park island after limping in there with an emergency oar and had to fix the rudder, but I couldn't cut down anything on shore because it was national park and I had to use driftwood, and I thought the trip was pretty much over, only 10% of the way through, and managed to get things going again. So I had dreams. I'd imagined getting out to the outer reef and sailing just on the inner edge of the outer reef and anchoring behind islands. But because, the canoe was, always a stone's throw away from snapping or something breaking and me having to get near shore, I felt it was safer to stick on the kind of inshore islands. There's often islands kind of halfway in from the reef, and they were the best ones because to camp ashore on the main beaches is too exposed because I couldn't drag it up the beach because it was too heavy. So my only safe option really was to duck in behind an island and anchor each night. So that's what I did. I just kept limping my way north whenever the weather was suitable, and if the wind was too strong, too light, or from the wrong direction, I would have to wait it out on an island.
Wow, so you actually did also, kind of like that TV show Alone, make it a little bit harder for yourself than what it traditionally might have been for First Nations people, because they always did these canoe journeys in teams, like you mentioned, so they'd have multiple people to carry it up the beach and things. So you went one step harder, but maybe that's what James Morrill would have had to do, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, if he'd tried to escape, whether he would have done it solo or whether someone would have gone with him, definitely with a team you can drag a canoe up the beach. So that, in some ways, that was my Achilles heel, not being able to pull it out. The other Achilles heel I had was it couldn't sail upwind at all. So if I was aiming for an island and I missed it by 2 metres, I couldn't get upwind to it. So sometimes I would literally throw the anchor out and drag myself in that way. That was really tense because sometimes, when it's blowing 20 knots, if you miss that island and it's approaching dark and all you've got downwind of you is a ragged, exposed coastline, you're going to lose the canoe because sure I'd get to shore, but my canoe would be smashed up by the waves and I'd be swimming ashore at night time amongst the crocs. So I've been in that situation before in tinnies. It's not very nice. So, it was pretty tense when I was trying to get in for an anchorage every time.
Wow, that is intense. So how seaworthy, honestly, was this canoe? Or did you have a few engineering issues with the canoe? I mean, you mentioned the rudder snapped. Yeah,
it is actually quite seaworthy. Because I built the bow and the stern up, I ended up surviving some pretty nasty conditions. So the Achilles heel is the fact that it can't go upwind. So it's a one-way street. That's the biggest danger, and that's the same thing really that the olden day sail ships ended up having to deal with. There's a place up three-quarters of the way out Cape York called Wreck Bay, which is a bay that kind of only opens to the southeast, and when it's blowing southeast, the sailors would just follow up the reef, not realising, because they didn't have the maps back then, that it curved around, and they would realise they're in a bay, and they just couldn't get out of it. They'd sail backwards and forwards and just slowly end up wrecking in the bay, which is why it's called Wreck Bay. But yeah, it's fairly seaworthy, but there was other things that I discovered as well, like when I had two sails, a small sail for high winds and a big sail for less strong winds, and when the big sail was up, the whole canoe would tilt forward due to just the pressure point of the sail. So all of the water that sloshed aboard with the waves pulled in the bow where I couldn't get to it because there was hatches and gear in the way. So I ended up kind of sinking bow first and then losing steerage. And so, yeah, particularly towards the end where I had to just commit to conditions which were too dangerous because there was a crocodile hanging around where I was. My condition was going down. I ended up committing to seas that I wouldn't normally, and really that combination of factors meant that I was just really close to capsizing in a very crocky spot.
And in at least the second half of the trip, probably more, you were basically on a completely remote coastline, one of the most remote coastlines of Australia. No real towns, no people for miles, just you and the crocodiles. So did you ever have a moment where you thought, yep, I'm definitely going to die?
Well, certainly that capsize was probably the closest. I've certainly had plenty of close encounters with crocs before when they've been stalking me or snapped at me as I'm trying to release a fish and all that kind of stuff. And as you say, like once you get past Cooktown, you commit it. There's nowhere other than Lockhart River, which for my canoe would be difficult to drag back along the road from there anyway. There's nowhere to stop, and that is where the crocs start getting more dangerous. So, and for my film, I interviewed several people who'd survived crocodile attacks, including a guy called Tony Ailing, who was attacked north of, close to Lizard Island, actually, where Lizard Island is on the coast there, north of Cooktown. And he was scuba diving on an inshore reef. And really, the croc numbers are increasing to their normal levels. And obviously, this debate's raging about whether they should be culled or not. They are part of the ecosystem. I would rather that they not be interfered with and they get back to their normal levels. But yeah, so because that number is increasing, and so Tony's up there the whole time, and he's now not diving north of Cooktown. That's one of his mitigation measures because it's too dangerous. So I was diving for crayfish, and by myself, it's plenty of people do it, but it's nerve-wracking. And when you're by yourself and the water's murky, plenty of times I decided not to. And sometimes when I decided not to, I would then see that there was a croc nearby. So it's really quite tense doing that kind of stuff. But when you need the food, it's kind of a risk that you take.
Wow, such an incredible survival tale. You mentioned capsizing at one point.
I didn't actually capsize. I was right on the edge of it. And yeah, the build up to that situation was, it was towards the end of the journey, I was weaker and there was crocodiles. I'd been stuck on an island for 10 days. And when I finally got off that island, the winds were still dicey. And when I got to the next island, there was, a big croc hanging around that was swimming towards me and stuff. And so I would sleep under the hatches at night in that situation. But I didn't want to get stuck on that island for 10 days because of that croc risk increasing. So I ended up just committing to seas that I wouldn't normally commit to. And with Torres Strait, you get the inflow and outflow from the Gulf Carpentaria every 6 hours. So there's a 6-hour window where the current is flowing strongly against the southeast trades, and you get a scenario called weather tide, and the seas stand up really high with a really short wavelength and they break more easily. You get swamped more easily. So in that 6-hour window, conditions get really nasty, and that's where the bow was filling up. I was effectively sinking bow first, had waves rolling across the deck, and just nearly tipped over and managed to stop it and get going again, and then winds increased and my boom snapped, and it was really, really quite tense. So there's plenty of hairy moments, that's for sure.
Oh my goodness, my heart nearly stopped when you were telling that story. But although the journey was obviously incredibly difficult, you also would have been travelling through some of the most wild, pristine and beautiful places on the planet with so much wildlife around you, not just crocodiles. So what were some of the highlights of the journey? Absolutely.
And for that first half up to Cooktown, it's quite stressful because people are constantly coming over and saying, "Hey mate, what you doing? Oh, I'll give you some food." And that's terrible. You don't want to interact with people because they're always nice and they're always helpful and they always offer food. And they think they're being helpful by continuously offering you food. "Oh, you sure, mate?" And so I try to avoid people. So it was a relief to get past those population centres. And you're right. It does. I love the extreme remoteness of it and to feel like you are alone. And that's quite close. The coastline that James Morrill would have seen if he'd done it, from Cooktown north, looks the same, with one exception, and that is that Aboriginal people were managing the landscape with traditional burning in a way that increased the biodiversity and maximised the plant species that the desirable animals and humans eat. So when he looked ashore, he would have seen more grassland instead of bushland. So Cooktown, for example, where Cook came ashore, his artist drew Grassy Hill. They call it Grassy Hill. Now it's not grassy, and that's because traditional burning's been stopped. And
you mean it's covered in trees now?
It's covered in trees, and there's almost no grass on the ground. And so one of the other aims of the trip, I want to hook people with a genuine adventure, but it's also to show that the Australian landscape is different now. It's harder for humans to survive because there's less food. That also means it's harder for our grass-eating animals like kangaroos and wombats to survive because there's probably less than a tenth of the food in the landscape. So all of the carnivores that eat kangaroos, there's less of them as well. So yeah, part of the reason I want to raise awareness of what's happening on land and the ocean, which I'll get to as well, but what's been good is that I liaise closely with Queensland National Parks and all of the authorities up the reef beforehand, and there's been a real shift in Queensland National Parks. Now they are really facilitating Aboriginal people doing traditional burning, which is fantastic. Federal parks are doing it as well. Our southern state national parks still have the colonial mindset, which is well-intentioned, that humans shouldn't touch the landscape. But because Aboriginal people were for such a long time and they were doing it in a way that increased the food sources for animals, they were actually beneficial. So we really need to allow Aboriginal people back onto country to do their traditional burning for the sake of the plants and animals. So that was one aspect. But I was also comparing what's happening in the Great Barrier Reef as far as fishing goes. So I was really quite surprised that I did not catch a single fish trolling all the way from Townsville until I got pretty much a beam Lizard Island. That's 700 kilometres trolling, didn't catch a fish. Now, there were modern fishermen around me using modern tackle, screaming around from one GPS point to the next. They were catching fish and stuff. That's because they were using modern tackle. But for lures, I was using a teaspoon, like a rusty teaspoon with a hook on it, and a homemade popper with possum fur on it, which is like carved out of beach hide biscuits. So those limitations meant I didn't catch a fish trolling. But when I got past the population centres, past Cooktown, then I started to catch fish. And that, to me, is a fairly clear indication of overfishing. And that allows me to bring in the need for green zones and things like that. And it's pretty hard when you're starving and you've got to pull your line in because you're going through a sanctuary zone. But those rules are needed. And so getting that across in a film where people are just like generally watching and they're like, oh, okay, and there's a need for those sanctuary zones. Like, okay, all right, I'll take that on board. And that's one of the aims of my film, is to highlight those kinds of issues.
Amazing. Here at Word on the Reef, we are all about protecting the Great Barrier Reef. So it's great to see that you sailed wind-powered with no fossil fuels, no single-use plastics. You were using all the old-fashioned biodegradable materials. We love to see it. And obviously, you still had to eat those. So how did you source food?
Because I knew that there'd be times when I couldn't fish, that I couldn't forage on national park islands, I prepared food that he could have reasonably prepared. So in his book, he talks about hunting wallabies with Aboriginal people. So I just bought kangaroo from Woolies and dried it myself. I gathered native ginger, native honey, coconuts. Now, this is interesting too. So I was listening to a JCU botanist the other day, and the evidence does suggest that coconuts weren't established. The current variety of coconuts, the ones that you see on the postcards, they weren't growing on the Australian mainland when Cook arrived. And also James Morrill. That they were introduced, yeah. So James Morrill says in his book in 1846 that he found them washed up on the beach and he would eat them, but he never found them growing. Now, there was some Cairns variety of coconuts that were native, but other than that, they're not native. Mind you, I do like them because they're beautiful and they're a good survival food, but I know that they have their impacts. So I'd pre-prepared some of those bush tuckers so I could at least have something to eat when I was going through a sanctuary zone or if I was camped on a national park island. But really, the main thing I was eating was fish, and that really started after Cooktown. So I started off getting sharks and then mackerel and queenfish, probably every second day on average. And then I was hunting with a traditional spear and woomera, which, I'd learned to make, learnt that technique from Aboriginal people. And, I'd spear mullet and stingrays, and that's a very rewarding process when you actually get one, because it's pretty hard because you've got to allow for refraction, you've got to be very accurate with your shot. Once you get it, you've got to push it into the bottom of the seabed so it doesn't get off. Like it's really challenging, but I reckon it's probably one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my life, is to spear a fish with a woomera the way Aboriginal people did it.
Yeah, I'm sure it would be incredibly difficult, but it's also that you're selecting what you catch as well, as opposed to buying a fish from the supermarket, which could have been caught in a huge net that also catches bycatch and things like that. So I think there's something rewarding about doing it yourself in the sort of the natural way. And of course, another essential for survival is water. How did you find safe drinking water? And did you ever resort to the Bear Grylls technique? I won't say it on live radio, but I think many people probably know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, I actually made a reel about how to do that in a more safe way on my Outback Mike Instagram account. But yeah, I didn't resort to doing that because it makes it worse. Because if you drink your own urine, it's so high in salt that your body has to wee out more water to get rid of that salt, so it dehydrates you fast. There's really very few scenarios where that's actually going to be beneficial, unless you evaporate the water out of it, condense it, and then drink it, which leaves the salt behind.
Oh, wow. All the shows I've been watching have been wrong this whole time.
Yeah, they have, yeah, because people just like seeing footage of people drinking their own wee. Yeah, but yeah, as far as water goes, I would just collect it whenever I could. Even if I just filled up and I found stuff the next day, I would still always top up my water barrel and my water containers. And the last place I filled up was actually close to Cape Melville. There's a place where it's marked on rocks, H2O, and so Aboriginal people showed the early explorers where the water holes were, and they often marked them out. And so I just walked under these granite boulders. I could actually see approaching them, dingo tracks going to them, so I could tell there was going to be water there. And yeah, a little spring that I could fill up with. And that was the last time I filled up, because I knew north of there, to get fresh water up a creek, you got to go a long way up a creek. It's really crocky, a lot of, the winds. Sure, I could get blown up a creek, but then I've got to paddle against the wind to get out of it. So I thought that would probably be my last fill up, and it was. So I was rationing water, and I got stuck on this island for 10 days and rationing even further, and I got dehydrated to the point where my eyeballs were sticking to my eyelids, and in the morning I had to wake up and just pull outwards on my eyelids so it would unstick from my eyeball.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. But yeah, so water is definitely, obviously, one of the highest priorities.
Getting lost would also be a risk. So how did you navigate? Did you use the stars, or did you have paper maps?
Yeah, so I bought charts that he would have, that were from that period. And I had a compass on the boat, which he had a compass, I'm pretty sure he mentions, but, you can get that off the ship that he came from. And I had a sextant, and he definitely had a sextant because his captain took one aboard the raft. So I used a sextant. I was taking noonday sights effectively just to get my latitude. It wouldn't have been reasonable to expect that he had a timepiece to be able to get his longitude, but mostly I was able to just use the chart to navigate visually from, that bay to that headland and line up with that hill. But when you get past Princess Charlotte Bay, it's hard to do that. So I would occasionally pull out the sextant, do a noonday sight, and it would just tell me how far north I was, which is all you really need because it's a north-south coastline. So all you need to know is how far up you are.
The amount of skills you have up your sleeve, like to be able to use in the modern day a sextant like they did back in the day, and you mentioned, I guess, using the sun for a midday reading. These are lost arts for many people, but they could be really important in the future if if the internet stops working or our technology fails or the satellite links stop working. So you'll be the last person alive on Earth, I think.
Yeah, well, it's good to have an excuse to learn those things. So, I had to learn how to use a sextant, but also understanding how the planets work and how they affect tides and how the sun moves. All those things really are effective. And in some ways, it's one of the strength of Aboriginal people is that they really understood all of those factors in quite a deep way. Like they understood the soil type and that informed their traditional burning. They understood the seasons, how they change. They use those little markers and stuff. And that's why that when you adjust one thing in the landscape here, they know the effect it will have in other places. So by being a generalist across all areas is actually better than being a specialist in one particular area.
Oh, yes. Where these days you could be an absolute expert at sort of, doing taxes. But if you're placed into the wilderness and need to have a broad range of survival skills, most of us would be very much in trouble. But it would be so free for those Indigenous people not needing any stuff. You don't need to bring any equipment with you because the stars and the natural elements is all you need to steer yourself and find your way and survive. So it's absolutely inspiring that you were able to learn that stuff. Okay, so obviously you had to sleep at various points, but you can't really sleep at sea because you don't have anyone else to be on watch. So did you just have to go for really long periods without sleeping, or you just had to make sure you made landfall every night, or how did you get sleep?
Yeah, so I basically had to pull in behind either a reef or an island each night to sleep. and I'd just throw the anchor out. It's quite stressful, particularly if there's no island in front of you, because you can never tell how deep the reef's going to be. You can still have decent waves coming over it. But I'd pull in behind an island, anchor, and then be up before dawn to try and get going as soon as there's enough light to sail. But stopping at the end of the day, it's pretty high risk to just stop at sunset, because then if you miss that island, you're going to be sailing at night. So I would try to stop a bit earlier. But then, when there's no wind, I would camp ashore. And I did that legally all the time. Like sometimes in the film, if you see me camping in the trees, I'm in a designated Queensland Parks camping site, which I paid $6.85 for. But if you see me camping below the high tide mark, that's because that's outside the boundary of the park. It's high risk because you got crocs. You're supposed to camp at least 50 metres back, and I'm camping below the high tide mark. So I put a fishing line tripwire around where I camped and just had it tied to some cutlery, so it would fall off and land on a plank and wake me up if a croc came up.
Wow.
Now, that never happened, but it certainly helps you to sleep more easily when, you've got some warning that a croc's coming.
Yeah, I can imagine. It would be hard to sleep a wink if you think that a crocodile might be creeping up on you in the middle of the night. All right, so we're into the last 10 minutes of the show, and I just want to ask about the mental impacts of being alone at sea for 50 days. I mean, we all know Tom Hanks in Castaway was famously talking to coconuts and giving names to inanimate objects. How was it for you being alone at sea for so long?
It's fine, really. It's hard, but the best coping mechanism is to compare what you're doing to other people who've done it harder. So I use people who in the trenches of World War I. I use Aboriginal people using the frontier wars, and could also imagine my shipwreck survivor, his raft journey from Minerva Reef to Townsville would have been 10 times harder than anything I experienced. So that always helps to put things into perspective. But your mind becomes sharper and sharper because you're relying on it every day to survive. And I remember when I finished in Thursday Island, my mind was sharp as a tack. Like if you threw me an arithmetic problem, I would be probably faster at answering it than I am now because your survival depends on it. I became more emotional for a couple of reasons. One, I somehow linked the worry that my family had for me to the worry that Aboriginal families must have had for their loved ones during the Frontier War, because I was interviewing elders and I was researched the history so much, and when an elder points out the valley where 500 of their people were massacred, like that really hits home. So I was quite tearful a lot. I also think the emotions coming out was because we suppress a lot of our emotions in Western society, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we do. And without that other people around, I think you just allow the emotions to come out more. And you're talking about Pacific Islanders, and they allow their emotions to come out more freely. Like they're big, tough men are much freer to cry, you know. So that's just a comparison. But also, like I knew that I was taking quite a risk, and that's one of the most stressful things. But there was a purpose to the risk. And because I am trying to communicate bigger picture messages, the better the story, the more risk, the more people will see the film and resonate, and the more people will listen to those kinds of important things that are happening on the reef, like coral bleaching, for example. You know, Lizard Island, 90% of the coral died around Lizard Island last year. Mm-hmm. And so if you can relate that to hey, I can't catch fish because the reef's dying, then it makes more sense. There's a reason to get across those messages. And I'd certainly encourage scientists like yourself. You're doing exactly what I encourage people to do. You are creating your own medium to get the information out there, because it's all well and good to know that, you know, this percentage of something happened, but unless you're getting that out to people, it's not really having the effect. And so what you're doing, getting that message out there, is great. And most scientists are constrained in what they can say because they're employed by the government. They can't talk out about the government. They've got to be very careful what they say. Even if it's not government, they might be applying for a grant. And if they say what they really think, maybe they won't get the grant next year. Mm-hmm. So having a social media platform is a way that you can actually say things. Now, obviously, if you're still employed, you can't say that on social media, but having a number of scientist influencers effectively, particularly if they can be free from the constraints of having their actual opinions silenced, it's really important. And I just encourage as many scientists to do the kind of thing you're doing as possible.
Oh, thank you. And I encourage people to go out there and film their adventures in nature like you are, because
Absolutely.
It's such a great avenue to get people to understand nature and things like the Great Barrier Reef. And it's pretty incredible that on top of all the challenges that you've just talked about of surviving alone, and then you also filmed an entire documentary at the same time, which I don't think we have time left to talk about how did you actually go about filming everything. And I really loved how you talked about that you were more free with your emotions and your mental clarity improved. And I think a lot of people out there would resonate with the fact that We're all addicted to our phones and social media, and it is dulling our emotions, our ability to connect with the real world, and it's probably dulling our intelligence as well. But it's good to know that even as little as 50 days of wilderness, which I suppose not all of us can go and survive in the wilderness for 50 days, but even just spending more time in nature can help to bring back that connection with the real world, with your emotions, and so on. So I find that really inspiring. Would you do this again? What's the next thing? Are you going to do any more canoe adventures? What's next?
I wouldn't do this one again just because I've done it and it was a big risk. And to do this again would mean that I don't do a new adventure. So I'm trying to keep my blinkers on and not concentrate on the next adventure, because this whole roadshow around Australia is its own adventure. But I certainly have some things in mind, and I want to do one in a bark canoe as well. And I'm just searching for a suitable... I've actually got it, but I don't want to announce what I'm doing yet because I've still got to analyse the risks first. Because once you say you're going to do something, you put pressure on yourself to do it because you've told people.
A bark canoe. Wow, that will be exciting. So everyone follow Mike on his website on YouTube. You can see all the rest of his behind-the-scenes stuff. And if you could build your dugout canoe again, would you change anything? If anyone wants to build a dugout canoe, would you work on a canoe 2.0, maybe with cup holders and Bluetooth speakers?
No, I would say just allow yourself 5 times the amount of time, because my hull is too thick, so I ran out of time to thin it out, and it would have sailed better if it was thinner. So just give yourself 5 times more time than you think you need.
Absolutely fantastic tip. It's been a real inspiration talking to you, Mike. And maybe for the last question, if anyone out there is listening and thinking, I'd love to do things like Mike, I want to be more like him, what advice do you have for aspiring adventurers?
Definitely just do as much as you can, go out on the weekends, and once you've been out and seen a few beautiful things, that draws you out. It's easier to motivate yourself when you know the rewards you're going to get. But I also encourage people to manage the risk carefully, and I mentioned in my film a film called Solo, where a guy tried to kayak to Tasmania, a really experienced guy, and he didn't make it, and I cover the impact that it had on his family. So you've really got to think about the risks, but really you do have to take some risks to get some gain. And in many cases, the bigger the risk, the bigger the gain. Just be very careful about it.
Yeah, you really, really have to prepare and know your stuff. So I would say don't try this at home until you've spent as much time training, researching, and that way you can save yourself from some strife. So we better make sure we talk about your documentary, Modern Day Castaway. Where can people watch it and how can they grab tickets, especially to the Cairns screening?
So if they just go to outbackmike.com, you'll see the links to Cairns. I think it's the 17th.
Yeah, next Thursday the 17th, everyone, at Trinity Bay School, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the reasons I'm doing it at schools is because I offer a free school talk to the school kids, just so they can see kind of what's out there. The same way I got to see the Bush Tucker Man and Top Gun, and you see a whole new world. And then I show the film in the hall at night time, and that supports the school in another way. Because, yeah, it's important for kids to see those things. It's quite inspiring for kids. It is rated M because there is some coarse language. It's all warranted swear words. But, basically people from bringing their kids from 8 and up, and no one's having any issues with it because they can just see it's part of the intense emotional thing that's happening. So, yeah, please jump on my website. You can book your tickets there. It's $25 for adults, $15 for children, pensioners and students. And, let your friends know. It would be really good, please. And I've got the canoe there as well, so that you can see the canoe. It's an 85-minute film, and then I do a talk about what got me into it and what happened behind the scenes, how I filmed it, and some things that I didn't get to talk about in the film.
Yes, so if anyone wants to meet Mike and ask him any more questions, which I didn't get to cover in this interview today, make sure you head along to that, meet him in real life. Mike Atkinson, adventurer, survival expert and filmmaker. He sailed 1,500 kilometres along the Great Barrier Reef in a homemade canoe. Congratulations on doing it, and thanks for joining us on the show today, Mike.
No worries. Thanks heaps for having me.